Hello, this is Blake.
I'm Carter.
And I'm Caitlin. Welcome to the KBC podcast where we discuss events of historical importance.
Today's topic is how social groups and political figures brought about the 18th Amendment and the struggles along the way.
Old John has been a champion years beyond a doubt, but now it looks as if they'll count him out.
Pardon?
I'm singing Every Day Will Be Sunday When the Town Goes Dry by Edward Meeker. The song embraces Prohibition and is a great segue into our first topic.
He's right. First, you're going to want to know what the 18th Amendment actually did for our country. The 18th Amendment, once ratified, made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors within any territory of the United States prohibited.
Oh, so Old John is alcohol and Prohibition is getting rid of him.
Exactly. Take a step back in time with us to the early 20th century where America was a lot drier but quite a bit angrier. To truly understand this complex topic of prohibition, let's go back to the late 1800s where temperance reform originally started. Did you know that although temperance didn't take off until the late 19th century, there were early signs of temperance of alcohol in the American Revolution?
Really?
Yes, during the American Revolution, Benjamin Rush, a United States statesman and physician, advocated for temperance of alcohol so soldiers would focus more on fighting and less on drinking.
I remember reading about that in an article by Richard Ham, a social science professor at University at Albany.
Yes, groups in the late 1800s adopted Rush's strategy of temperance because they started to see alcohol as an issue in modern society. They did this through their own actions due to the government officials not enforcing their policies.
So dry radicals who believed in temperance were brought about due to the Second Great Awakening. In a short summary, the Second Great Awakening was a Protestant religious revival in the United States from 1795 to 1835. This brought about enthusiastic social reform movements, especially abolitionism and temperance. They wanted people to reject sin and instead live morally upstanding lives.
So because of the Second Great Awakening, many middle-class Americans started to change their views on alcohol because they thought that alcohol was weakening society and destroying individuals.
A few groups that adopted temperance included the Anti-Saloon League, the National Prohibition Party, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, for short the WCTU.
Women promoted temperance because families were being torn apart and it was bad for the children to see adults under alcohol influence.
I mean, it was becoming a bit of a problem. There are over 100,000 saloons in America, and with cities over 50,000 inhabitants, they had a saloon for every 250 people. They even violated policies such as selling to minors.
How did these temperance groups impact society? I'd like to know.
Well, the WCTU took it to the saloon owners and went knocking on their doors. They demanded they stop selling alcohol and started to protest heavily against the commerce of it.
These groups are far from your moderate activist groups. They put their heart and soul into making a change. They use tactics such as lobbying, agencies that push temperance policy and reform programs across the country.
These lobbyist groups shame drinkers in an attempt to promote their causes.
Goodbye, Hunter. So long, Scotch. Farewell, Hag and Hag. Oh, my little snow gin fuzz. You're going out of biz.
Didn't these groups eventually get policy into the big white building where important decisions are made?
Absolutely. These groups were backed heavily by none other than Minnesota's very own Congressman Andrew Volstead, who advocated for women's rights and prohibition. Ray Catherine Egme wrote a very insightful article that shows how Andrew Volstead impacted prohibition.
In fact, he is considered the father of prohibition.
He wasn't the only one to ignite the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was a federal change to the Constitution that outlawed the manufacturing and buying and selling of alcohol.
Religious groups that persisted in changing the federal constitution were pressured largely because of religious ideals.
Religious groups such as the WCTU, the IOGT, the Sons of Temperance, the National Prohibition Party, and eventually the Anti-Saloon League of America worked to promote their new utopia of how society ought to behave, as suggested by the article Constitutional Blemishes, American Alcohol Prohibition and Repeal as Policy Punctuation.
Religious folks such as Methodists and Presbyterians saw prohibition as a needed corrective to the nation's moral laxity to the social problems of the nation.
No more saying just one more. No more nightcap. No side door.
Not this again.
He's got a point. The moral and social problems of America were the relations between the family institution and alcohol, as well as a great dependence on alcohol in most daily activities. This disruptive nature was criticized by most religious groups. With prohibition implemented, these issues would no longer be as prevalent.
Volstead was not only a prominent figure throughout the Prohibition movement, he also was an advocate for women's rights. Volstead rallied for the 19th Amendment to be ratified. He targeted the rights of women so an extra group of people voted for him so he could continue pushing his political agenda.
It's impressive that Volstead's work led to the creation of the 19th Amendment.
The 19th Amendment was an amendment that gave all women the right to vote, giving many women the courage to speak up and advocate for change.
Advocates for the temperance movement pushed for the 19th Amendment because they believed women would vote for prohibition due to their moral superiority. That's why Volstead rallied behind these women's temperance groups.
That's right, and it is why breweries and anti-prohibition groups lobbied against the women's suffrage movement out of the fear of losing their businesses to prohibition.
Unfortunately, it later came out that Volstead wasn't practicing his own preaching.
In March of 1920, there was a very lengthy debate between Volstead and two newspapers, the St. Paul Pioneer Press and the Sun. Both newspapers published stories that proved Volstead was not dry. In reality, he was half wet, which goes against the movement he was trying to maintain.
Volstead was considered half wet because he was advocating against drinking and all things alcohol, but he continued to take part in these activities.
How did the women in the temperance groups react to this?
Many groups became angry with the hypocritical movement Volstead was trying to push, resulting in Volstead losing his Congress position in the next election.
After the loss of the election, many groups of people began withdrawing their support from the Prohibition movement, which caused heavier anti-prohibition movements.
Examples of anti-prohibition support came through heavily in many different forms of propaganda.
As you probably heard Blake sing in a little tune throughout, it was "Every day is Sunday when the town goes dry," which is an example of the radical movement. This song discusses the feeling that people had after the prohibition of alcohol.
Many were moved by this song. It changed perceptions for those who were not entirely sure about their stances of prohibition, along with the different groups seeing what perspective each other had on it.
Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed your time spent here. Prohibition was a very interesting time with many reform groups, lots of legal change, and government officials that pushed for changes in the country. Thank you.
We'll catch you next time for the next episode of the KBC podcast.
And here are our sources.